You are listening to Theatrum Mundi Live. Welcome to Staging Cities, a new podcast series from Theatrum Mundi, looking at the ideas on the intersection of stagecraft, architecture, and urban planning. We are borrowing from the toolkit of theatre making to think about city making. This new podcast accompanies a series of books we are working on with NI10 publishers from Rotterdam. In the first 3 podcasts in Staging Cities, we're discussing storytelling and architecture, drawing on ideas from the first volume produced with NI10 that is out just now in July 2021, and that's Concrete and Ink, Storytelling and the Future of Architecture. And this book brings together commissioned writing in fiction, non-fiction, a graphic story, and interviews. To put this book together, we asked the artists to think about ideas between utopia and dystopia. We were interested in what role the storytelling plays in urban imaginaries. We look at the ways those urban imaginaries converge or diverge from reality. We were also particularly interested in how cities are constructed, reconstructed, and deconstructed through storytelling. All the narratives that kind of sit behind the decision-making. And particularly in who tells the story, who are the characters, what is their relationship to the city, the building or the place, as well as to each other. And from the pieces that we published in the book, we were also quite curious to see to what degree a building or a place is a character or a setting for a story. So that's the book, and it's available now from theatrum-mundi.org/shop in a beautiful design by Atelier Dajkova. And I had a great pleasure of editing it together with my colleague Justinian Trebion. To accompany the book, we invited 6 writers and artists who contributed to it into conversations around structures and buildings that make up the city. And these are the tower block, the mall and the museum, and the shed and the ruin.
Welcome to Marlin Station. For your safety and security, CCTV is in use throughout London Underground.
My name is Marta Michalowska, and I'm Associate Director at Theatrum Mundi, and I'm hosting these 3 first podcasts in Staging Cities. And now I would like to welcome writer Alia Trabuco-Zarang, who is joining us from Santiago in Chile, and artist Bedwyr Williams, who is joining us from North Wales. And we're going to talk about the malls and museums, and this is the second podcast in the series.
Hello, Marta. Thank you so much for this invitation. Hello, Bedwyr. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today and to be able to discuss our works and what Theatrum Mundi has been doing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation from me as well. Nice to meet you, Alia, and nice to be talking to you again, Marta.
Thanks, Bedwyr. And just to give our listeners a little bit of introduction, Alia was born in Chile in 1983. Her debut novel, La Resta, The Remainder, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize International in a translation by Sophie Hughes, who also translated her piece for the Concrete and Ink book. She writes in Spanish, and she's about to publish Las Homicidas in English, as far as I know. It's also going to come out by Another Stories, as far as I know. And that's anytime really now.
Yes, I think it will be published by the end of the year or maybe the beginning of next year, so very soon.
And she lives in between London and Santiago and currently is in Santiago. But it would be great if you could just tell us a little bit more kind of about your practice in general, about your writing.
I'm currently writing a new novel. I've written 2 full-length books, La Resta, which is about, the issue of historical memory in Chile, and Las Homicidas, which is a non-fiction book about women who kill, and it's a retelling of 4 iconic cases of of women who kill. So hopefully you can read that in English in a few months. And I write a fiction and non-fiction. And I would say, interestingly, that when Marta invited me to write this piece, it was something I was already thinking about. So it was like this perfect match where I would have some pressure to finish this story, where I was actually thinking about this particular space, the mall, and its sinister character, and how architecture can somehow also symbolize and symbolize a country's destinies in a way, and also shape people's subjectivities. So usually in my practice, I am thinking about these things in both more political or abstract terms, and both in narrative terms. So it was an ideal fit to be able to write this story.
Excited to welcome you back to the place to eat on the third floor. Enjoy tasty hot meals, light snacks, mouth-watering cakes, and refreshing drinks for the whole family. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Alia. And that's you based your story on an existing building, which is there in Santiago and can be visited.
It can. It's called. The story is based on this building that's called the Costanera Center. It's I believe the biggest shopping mall in Latin America, with a very big, tall tower right next to it. And I had been already compiling news articles about the origins of this building first, and then about people who go there to commit suicide. This is something that happens regularly. There was a case, I would say 2 or 3 weeks ago, and what happens in this mall is that this is not fiction, is that people go there and they commit suicide, and then they just put up a tent on top of the body, and the mall keeps working, and people keep shopping, and it's just how it is, it's been sort of normalized. So I had already been compiling this news because I found it just symbolically so precise of the moment of the sinister character that capitalism can have. So it is a shopping mall that it is open whenever we're not in lockdown. It's kind of the first place that opens now in the it's funny. It's that, like, schools are closed, but the mall is open. So it's a very interesting place. It was inaugurated by the president, who was a socialist, between inverted commas, in the early 2000s, and he would say this was like the symbolic building of success, of Chile's neoliberal success. So it was the success narrative of neoliberalism what was symbolized in this building, and yet it is the place where many people go and commit suicide. So that's the contrast I wanted to work with in this short story.
Possibly commit suicide due to the forces of capitalism that drive them into that decision. But what I read about this, we will talk a little bit more about architects and the design of those spaces. But I read that this was Cesar Pelli, a rather renowned architect who built that space. He also is behind the Kuala Lumpur's Petronas Twin Tower. So it was a pretty big name architect attached to create this, as I read in one article, a macabre vanity project for Chile. So perhaps that summarizes it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And well, the phallic character of the building too. It's very. You can see it when the city is not covered by smog and pollution. You can see it from everywhere. So it is a very interesting building that does like kind of what the story of Chile has been since 1990 until, I would say, a few weeks ago, because we are shifting direction now in this country politically towards a less neoliberal country. I think it's all there in that particular building, and it's in its story and in this present where people go there to die. So
keep your journey running safely and smoothly. Keep your belongings with you at all times. And if you see something that doesn't look right, speak to staff
Thank you so much for that. And then Bedwyr, you live in North Wales and you're an artist. We had countless exhibitions in rather major museums, one of which includes the piece, The Gulch at the Curve at the Barbican Art Centre in 2016, The Starry Messenger at the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester in 2015, Echt at Tramway in Glasgow in 2014, and that just to name a few. And you were shortlisted for the Theatrum Mundi Prize in 2016. And currently, you have a solo exhibition at the Savak Park Galleries presenting the latest work, actually specifically looking at museums, and the video piece that was created as a response to the Concrete and Ink invitation. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your work and your practice.
So, funnily enough or unfunnily enough, even though I rail against the vanity builds of highfalutin architects, I actually have spent most of my life actually living provincially, like away from malls or museums of any type. And I guess in a way that's why I'm so obsessed with, big oblique buildings or, big arse-shaped buildings that make a statement, is that no such building will ever be built where I live. It's not happening. It won't happen. And neither will there be huge malls either. So they kind of exist in a kind of between state for me, almost like a fantasy, even when I'm in one, I'm not sure it's real. I remember having my neck massaged by these people called massage angels in the giant mall in Stratford in East London,
Westfield, yeah.
This combination of somebody massaging my neck and all the hubbub and the distant fear of maybe terrorism as well in one place was horrendous, like some kind of laboratory from a nightmare or something. So yeah, I guess I've got an interest in strange spaces. I've in the past set works in spaces that no longer exist. So there was the hotel with the 70-degree corners that I recreated in CGI, and then was able to invent narratives to take place in there. I guess my fear, being in a discussion like this with somebody who is a proper writer, is I'm by no means a writer. I'm just an artist who likes using text. And I have a crippling imposter syndrome whenever I am asked to talk about my writing in my practice.
Oh, I have it too.
Okay, that's good. I feel a lot better.
So it's probably least confident pair of writers I have here, but hey. But I was quite happy editing and publishing your work. So I mean, if that's of any important as approval, you certainly have my approval. In your your stories are both fantastic and incredibly well written. So I think you should be a little bit more confident about your text works. I guess maybe, but actually I would like to ask you also, when you got this brief, what were you thinking? What led you to actually create this text and then the video?
I think because most of this took place during lockdown, right? Most of the writing on my part. And I was starting to kind of miss the gallery, or a gallery. And as a younger artist, I'd worked in a gallery not dissimilar to the gallery in my story, and so I'd been privy to some of the, some of the comings and goings and the toings and froings that happen behind the scenes in a gallery, and how egos are balanced and set against each other, and how the public is viewed from behind these sleek kind of facades and exteriors. And so, yeah, I was hankering after the experience of being in the gallery space, but also I've always been fascinated by how, say the Guggenheim in Bilbao or something still has to have a disabled toilet and get rid of the trash at the back. I like the to think of like the private parts and the stinky bits of these big signature buildings. To kind of, because the architects never talk about those things. No, like they hide the creche or they hide the kitchen or something like that. And I think it's funny, for me at least, to just peel it away and just show that stuff, the banal aspects of like fancy architecture will always amuse me. I remember going to inside the Sinfonia in Miami Beach for some weird performance project. And there was an argument about a piano or about the dust sheet that sat on the piano. And it was so unglamorous and funny. And yeah. So I'm always looking out for things like that.
It's in a way, that's very fascinating to kind of try to peek behind the scenes in those kind of buildings. But it's interesting that you both took in your pieces looking at not the kind of front of the house or those spaces. So Alia's piece is centered around the friendship of cleaners, the people who have to clean up the mess after everyone else. But maybe you could, Alia, read a little bit from your piece now to give us a sense of it.
Yes, of course. I just wanted to say that, I'm also quite fascinated, like Bedwyr here, about the behind the scenes of these supposedly glamorous places, and especially the people who are behind the scenes and that are also made invisible by this. By the architecture of the place too, in a way. So it was for me, when reading all these news pieces about people committing suicide, I would think about the person committing suicide. But what really was striking for me were like the people who are the cleaners that would have to take care of that, and how that's a part of a job. Not only cleaning the bathrooms and the toilets and the floors and the escalators, but cleaning the blood and hiding a corpse. So it's like this really symbolic mess that they cover first, then call the police or whatever. But it's what they do. So what Bedwyr was saying about the unglamorous was something that for me was also quite interesting. So I'll read only a couple of paragraphs. As Marta said, this has been translated by the fantastic genius Sophie Hughes, and I always read very poorly in English. I don't know why. I think I speak a lot better than how I read. I get nervous. But I'll do my best and read a couple of paragraphs. So the story is called La Zona Ciega, the blind spot, and I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs. Time was hazy in that place, which neither Omar nor Vilma actually said, but if someone had asked them how many months they had worked in the mall of infinite escalators, they would have shrugged their shoulders and answered with a silence. There is no day or night in there, no inside or outside, only windows and steel and floor tiles and displays, and that music playing on loop with no beginning and no end. On the other hand, if someone had asked La Original how long she'd been in the building, she would have answered, 7 years, 9 months, 2 weeks, 4 days. That labyrinth of window displays, mop, disinfect, air freshen, disappear. Although some said she also attended the cleaning job interviews, where she would listen to the applicants' names and surnames and try to pick out the lies. Fake enthusiasm, fake cheerfulness, fake experience, nothing got past her. But a debt's a debt, and a job's a job. So they all feigned commitment to the role and promised to be disciplined, while Roxana predicted the exact date each of them would leave. It was at one such interview that she first saw David, even if he didn't recall the encounter. Spiked up hair, thick lips, a piercing in his eyebrow. She felt as if she already knew him, that she'd seen him somewhere, but she didn't know from where or when, and she gave up trying to remember. David came from Calama and apparently shared a room with a cousin. He was a good liar, full of smiles, although she sensed a sadness in him. La Original gave him 3 months at a push, and she wondered who his trigger would be. A new mom, a depressed teen, or maybe just a kid like him. Little less than a man, little more than a boy. I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And that's where the story begins. We will try to keep the spoilers out from the story, so the audiences can pick up the book and read the rest. But it's quite fascinating, the piece about a friendship in this rather unexpected place between people who are rendered pretty much invisible by the space where they work. And Bedwyr also has already recorded his reading of his story to be part of the video piece, the militia, that is still at the moment of recording. It's still possible to see it at the gallery and Savak Park galleries. So we're just going to play a short extract from the piece to give a feel for the kind of style of writing and narration.
The militia. The gallery staff had been locked in the gallery's offices for almost 4 days when the first of the militia managed to find a way in. The museum quarter of the city, of which the gallery was a part, hadn't been the focus for any of the groups that had been occupying shops and public spaces with impunity for almost a week. But when they saw the giant anchor outside the keel-shaped Maritime Museum crashed in through its keel-shaped glass annex, they knew that the gallery would be next. They came via the gift shop after peeling back the security shutter. From the recently upgraded security cameras, the old ones had become totally blind after years of staring at bright white walls. The director could see that the intruders had browsed briefly before they started smashing things up. She shook her head quietly as large, shrink-wrapped exhibition catalogues were thrown across the shop, smashing into works for sale on the shelves, sending fragments and splinters of ceramic and coloured glass across the floor. Some of the younger-looking militia started launching craft items upwards towards the ceiling and pretended to run for cover as they came back down. The components of a humorous porcelain tea set in the shapes of breasts, bottoms and genitals were lobbed one by one into the light well of the basement level where the toilet and cloakrooms were. The gallery's incredibly heavy, MDF heavy, not coin heavy, pyramid-shaped collections box was tipped over on its side, and the last 6 months' coins and the 3 £20 notes they always left in there were pocketed. The till was yanked from its moorings. The shop manager at the director's side, looking at the screen, breathing noisily, could see some of his personal belongings being passed and thrown around. He saw his small umbrella opened up and destroyed, and the rubber clogs he wore during the day behind the cast concrete counter flung somewhere behind the carousels of greetings cards. Finally, an index card system with the details of all the different makers who supplied the shop was tossed into the air. Surprise, surprise, now they're looking at the naked pictures in the photography section, the shop assistant said. Are they? Are they? We might not agree with anything these people say they stand for, but we should be careful about what we decide to mock them about.
I really wanted to bring the two of you in conversation because of the kind of spaces you chose to think about it through this commission to be part of Concrete and Ink. Because Theatrum Mundi is particularly interested in public space in the city and what a public space in a city could be, and whether these places are actually public or not, that we can discuss. But in a way, the mall and the museum are probably the kind of most iconic spaces that are built within cities and that bring public into them. And actually, as I was preparing to discuss this with you, I actually looked at quite a lot of malls and a lot of museums, and I was wondering about the kind of similarities and differences. And actually, one site that I spent most of the time looking at was actually TripAdvisor, because actually TripAdvisor will tell you what to see in cities, and actually a lot of you can see on the side by side, pretty much. Both of those spheres, both malls and museums. So perhaps we could think about them as a kind of a tourist industry key spaces. And particularly, I was looking at spaces in London, and I was wondering who designed them. And I didn't realize, but they're actually the Cold Drops Yard in King's Cross, which is also, I think, Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design is part of that space. It actually was designed by Hedwick Studio. So again, a major architecture practice designing something that is attached to an art school, but it is very much a mall. While I was thinking in the past that actually the mall was as a tacky cousin of the museum, maybe a more kitsch cousin of the museum, but perhaps that's no longer quite the truth. I was just wondering, because you've written about those two spaces, what do you think about them as a kind of places that attract tourism?
Well, first, I'll divert a bit from the question just to go to think out loud about the public character of this space, of the mall in particular, and just to set a bit of context about the Chilean history. As you may already know, Chile was kind of the neoliberal experiment of the world and the first country to go in that direction full on with the Chicago Boys during the Pinochet dictatorship in the 80s. So malls were built back then, like many malls in the 80s, and then the democratic governments of the post-dictatorship in the 90s also embraced the same ideology, neoliberalism. So buildings like the Costanera Center were built as kind of symbol of this supposed success, right? And it was a time of privatizations of everything. Chile is, for example, the only country where water is private. So everything's private here. And this implied the privatization of public space too, and privatization, and people started considering the mall as a public space. But the question, Marta's question of whether it is or it isn't, because it's privately owned. All these buildings are privately owned, but they're occupied as if it was a public space. So it is like an ambiguous state. And this was, I would say, they were like regular malls in many ways for a long time, but then protests started erupting in Chile since 2011, and many of these protests started taking place in the malls. So it's interesting how it was this space that was really private in a way, because it is behind walls, and it is privately owned, but they became these places where people and students would go protest and start screaming and start yelling and occupy the space. So I think it's because of its symbolism, it has this shifting identity, and even though it is private, it is also public, and its ambiguity is something that also interests me. So I will leave it here, but that's I think a first reflection that comes into my mind with Marta's introduction about the public or private character of this ambiguous and dystopian place, really, because even though things are rapidly changing in Chile right now, the mall is still a place where people gather. So it's Sunday or Saturday, and people are not going to to a park. People are going to the mall to just walk around and maybe not even buy anything, just to meet up and walk around. So it is rather dystopian, but it is also how things are. So I'd rather look at it face to face and not like say, well, why aren't people going to parks? Because there aren't any. So it's also, I don't want to judge it, it's just looking at it.
I find it quite fascinating, this thing that you say that actually a mall is or shopping center, as you would probably say over here, can be a site of protest. I had no idea that anyone would think about protesting in this kind of space. My personal experience of the kind of the more, maybe the more glamorous ones is actually mostly through traveling in the Middle East, where when you go to say UAE or you go to Qatar, the mall is the kind of, you open the tourist guide, and that's like there are museums, but also this is one of the key spaces that you are encouraged to go and visit, and perhaps the hotel would provide you with a shuttle to go to the most famous ones, such as maybe the Villaggio Mall in Doha, which is rather fascinating due to its a rather bizarre design, pretending to be a Venetian street. Why I've asked about the tourism, but I'm quite happy to stray and think about them as a much more layered spaces than as a public space where people can negotiate a very different interaction with them. But Bedouin, maybe you have something to say from your kind of slightly outsider's perspective.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I mean, as an artist is, if I was to look at what I do with really dumb eyes, I think like it's funny that for the most part my work is exhibited in buildings that are designed to look strange, so art galleries are designed either to be like this or like, and then I go in and I do my thing in there, or my friends that are artists do things there, and it seems strange that we've developed that as a norm, really, because for me, an art gallery really should be just like a completely nondescript box, no? And then you go in, and then inside, you have electricity in all the right places and places to hang things from the ceiling. It should be a machine for showing art, although that sounds awful. But it's strange how, and in my experience as well, working on public commissions, where, if you sit at a table of architects and you're the consultant artist, you might as well say that you're a clown or something, like you're very low on the levels there, on the different plateaus that exist. So I always have this kind of resentment, really, of the architecture when I'm exhibiting in a gallery. I always think that this is the flag to get the tourists there, the fact that the gallery is upside down or inside or outside. I kind of think almost like architecture should celebrate itself in museums to itself and leave art to get on with its own business, there's galleries get built with curved walls and so on, which makes it impossible for you to hang artworks on. And I think it's often a way for the director to celebrate themselves in concrete. And as an artist, I think maybe that time has passed, maybe there needs to be a much more functional approach as to how galleries are conceived and realized. Because, what will archaeologists make of this in 1,000 years' time when they find these strange aluminium buildings that are like, they'll see that there were toilets there and somewhere to eat, and not very good daylight coming into the main gallery. I think they'll be really baffled why they were so narcissistic, these buildings, and not very functional.
And it is truly fascinating that, yes, you're certainly right about this idea that the spaces are created to be art objects in their own right, some sort of fantasy sculpture made enormous in size and sitting within the city, and in a way competing for attention with the retail space of the mall.
There's one thing I was going to say, and I don't mean to be flippant talking about this thing at all. But when the child was thrown out of the window of Tate Modern by the court case was not so long ago. I remember thinking, so in the tabloid newspapers, they almost like pitched the story as if maybe contemporary art is to blame for children being thrown out of windows of gallery. I mean, they didn't say that, but there was a kind of, oh, what now with contemporary art? You know, a child almost dies or something. And on one level, I thought that the folly of how galleries look when you set them next to an actual tragedy or potential tragedy or somebody being hurt or killed, it seems even more ridiculous, maybe. You know, it's like, if you were to die in a private view and everybody is in the fancy spectacles and the expensive clothes and the shoes, then those clothes would seem ridiculous next to the dying person. You know, it'd seem absurd, like from a dream or nightmare.
Definitely. And well, but again, this is part of a viewing platform in a gallery in the Tate is not designed to be functional in any means as providing space to exhibit artworks. Is there to bring people through the door and to buy tickets, to buy coffee, to buy books, to buy merchandise. So being quite cynical about this, it's not a functional, necessary space. It's more of a kind of an add-on to provide kind of added value for the visitor. But I had this discussion in December last year. Theatrum Mundi, we're currently hosted by group work architecture practice in Clerkenwell and by architect Amin Taha, and we were discussing the idea of an ideal space for a gallery. And I was telling him that whenever I go working for the Wapping Project, my other role, working in different galleries and museums around the world, this first thing before we try to install an exhibition or even think about an installation is the list of things we can't do. Because I'm used to working in a more kind of post-industrial space where it was more like, how are we going to do it? Rather than, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't flood the building, you can't drill in the holes. So you're kind of wondering, why are these spaces the way they are and why they were designed like this? So it seems that in a way, they almost start resembling more of the kind of more space that is designed to exhibit precious objects of, clothing or handbags or shoes, which are neat, clean, and don't cause trouble. So that certainly is one of the things. But then maybe we could talk a little bit about the thing that both of the spaces, both the retail space and the museum space, particularly museum space, is kind of tasked with very often this grand task, which I imagine it comes partially probably in both of your works, is this cliche word of gentrification through producing those spaces. I don't know, Bedwyr, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think you have a particular take on gentrification through creating those kind of spaces.
Yeah, I think I left London in 1999, just around that time when somebody said that they'd seen David Bowie having a cappuccino on Brick Lane where I was living, and that seemed like a good time to leave, And what's interesting is I remember, other artists that I would meet around East London then would always be talking about great space. This is a great space. And I never really knew exactly what they meant, as in, I can see it as a space, but it's great in what way? Like potentially it's going to be great, or it's great as it is. And it turns out what they meant was it probably will be great to turn it into a Starbucks in 5 years' time. Or there's a Starbucks in Old Street where there's some brick wall exposed, and they've written in a kind of handwritten font, this wall has been left intentionally like this to show you the history of this building. So they don't even give you credit you with the intelligence to understand why it's been left like that. They're spoon feeding it to you or something. And I kind of see that almost like back of a smoothie bottle way of talking to people. It sort of pervades the whole kind of gentrification scene, you know, like little people in or not little people, but people in their weekend clothes taking little bite-sized bits of culture, eating certain kinds of brioche burgers, and then one thing after the next. It seems so fussy and selfish or something like that. You know, I think culture has, or how it manifests in big cities, has really entwined itself with the entertainment and hospitality business, which I think they're not the same thing for me.
Mm. Yeah, and also in particularly probably in the UK, but I imagine that happens in other countries. Is the new there was this whole movement of producing these new gallery spaces, usually with using rather known architects and making them unusual. So there's the Turner Contemporary these days, and there's the New Gallery wall. So
there's also a slightly problematic thing is that when they build these new places, they talk about them being landmarks, you know, and a landmark earns its stripes over time, you know, like an old poorhouse or an old mental asylum becomes a landmark. You know, it wasn't built as a landmark. And I think that's the mistake architects make, is that they think they're making history from the moment they cut the ribbon, you know, and there's nothing wrong with making, I think, boring but very good and useful buildings either, you know.
Just wanted to add an anecdote about what Bedwyr was saying about architects wanting to name the icon before it becomes iconic, you know. And it's like this. And when I was living in London, I went to Liverpool to visit my cousins who were born and they're British and live there. And so I went there with my partner, and we wanted to go to the Tate, of course, Tate Liverpool, and they had never been there. My cousins who live in Liverpool, and it was like this building that just existed there for tourists, you know, and to bring in people, but it sort of didn't really belong to the city, and it was also like already named as an iconic building or as this very relevant public space for the city. But I really also got the feeling that it was kind of built, giving its back to the city in a way. So you do wonder how those buildings do come in contact and interact with the people who actually live there, and how the people who inhabit the place are invited or not to these places, and they become really more elitist places. So it's interesting. Also, just wanted to share that.
It certainly is a tricky point between embracing the local people who live in places and then bringing new people in to these buildings that claim to be iconic. I'm just wondering whether this is the architects that claim creating icons, or is this more those that commission the buildings, that perhaps the politicians, the local councils, where perhaps the narrative actually sit and who actually owns it, and how they actually fund it, and that, you know, that obviously the funding structure probably actually determines what kind of narrative those places aim to project.
I think what is difficult is that, you know, as an artist, you know, when I'm busy, at least I get to travel quite a bit, you know, so I know a few people in Berlin and know a few people in Paris, blah, 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 New York. Whereas most local communities around these places don't have that life, and I don't do it very much, but, some super duper artists are constantly flying around the world, right? And they have this like almost, kind of idea that everywhere kind of can be their home when they're there for 2 months or something like that. And they know people there and they know their favorite restaurant around the corner and they remember them. But that isn't a reality for most people, is it? On a moderate to low income, it's an unreachable kind of lifestyle, I think, and because I often think like, an exhibition might be on in a museum for 2 months or something. And if this is a big museum in a provincial town, maybe you go to see it twice if you really like it, but it's just there. Meanwhile, the artist is in Sao Paulo or somewhere in a biennial or, launching something. So, yeah, I wonder sometimes about the people in the locales around these places, like how much thought is given to them,
Yeah, that is certainly, that's it's quite intriguing question, whether, and it brings this idea again, who is this public space created? Who is the public for that public space in a way? So in a way, malls have it a little bit easier because maybe you go there a little bit more often, but then I don't think anyone builds malls in provincial towns, really.
Yeah, true. I just wanted to share another anecdote because it's interesting how public places, whether they're public or not, and how they're protected. In 2019, in October, there was a big revolution here in Chile. We're now living the political changes that came from that. But so millions of people took on the streets here in Santiago, and the police were, repressing the people, but they were also protecting buildings, right? So they were establishing perimeters around buildings so that people wouldn't destroy them or just come close to them, because the goal wasn't to destroy any building. The people were walking towards the house of the government, but people were also gathering around this mall that I was writing about. So this place, the Costanera Center, was one of the places that was protected by the police against protesters. So it was the weirdest image, where people thousands of people were gathering there, and it was protected as if it was the U.S. Embassy, which was also protected in a way. But but it was which buildings were and were not protected was very interesting, because then the facade of a historical building here, it's called the Centro Cultural Gabriela Mistral, but it was built during Salvador Allende's government by workers and by artisans. So it's this very beautiful and weird kind of monumental building. But people were painting the facade, and it became like this place for expression. So that wasn't protected. And it was made very beautiful, by the protesters, the facade, especially the walls. But you couldn't come close to the mall. So what is and what isn't protected, and so what is public and what is not, I think is also seen in times of protest. So what people ended up doing was just pretending they would go shopping, enter the mall, and do the protest inside. So for me, all those strategies are also quite interesting, and in how you appropriate places, and they become public even though they weren't destined to be public.
That's quite I can imagine a mall being protected from the protesters as quite an image, but also it's kind of telling of obviously of the structures, of the choices that are made by the decision makers of what should be protected and what shouldn't be protected. But maybe, well, of course, we're talking about two different spaces that are kind of public and private, and both can have these iconic features. But then there's also something that if you look at the two spaces, there are certainly differences in the use of the retail space and the museum. But these days there are also a lot of similarities, as in your story, Red, where of course, the entrance and the exit is through the gift shop, and that's kind of how the building's vulnerability in your story.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking as well. There's the obvious similarity between a mall and a museum is how people walk around, like this. You know, it's for looking. Firstly, and buying. I mean, buying is the main objective, but you know that's how people walk around the mall is quite similar to how they walk around the gallery. But one thing I've noticed more and more since 2008 in the UK is, especially in smaller provincial malls, is, you know, the shops that disappear. So they leave an empty space in the mall, you know, like a tooth that's been knocked out or gone bad or something. And more they're being taken over in the smaller malls by small artist collectives or something. And what's funny is that, you know, all of the walls in these spaces or these units are designed for you to hang things on them, or everything is retail minded. But if you want to turn it, say, an old Argos into a gallery, then you're already fighting an uphill battle. The walls aren't smooth, and there's a horrible carpet, and the lighting is bad. And there's something so, as an artist, I should think it's great that there's a gallery in an old Argos, empty Argos in a mall. But there's something about the aesthetic that feels jarring, almost like apocalyptic or something like that, you know, like somebody with a painting of a horse hanging on a wall that used to be a catalogue shop. There's something really upsetting about that.
Well, just wanted to add that the gesture that Bedwyr was making of and the similarities of people walking inside a museum and people walking inside a mall, like looking, right, and staring, and the eyes being like a central element, and then someone jumping and then dying, right? Someone that jumps and dies to be looked at. In a way, right? To be looked at in this place, and then the body is of course covered by this little tent, and the violence the aesthetic violence, I mean, that produces in the audience, that's forced to become an audience of that particular gesture, is something quite striking and dramatic, and as Bedwyr was saying, apocalyptic and dystopian, apart from extremely sad, but so violent, really. This violence to the eyes that are supposed to be looking at things they want, you know, in the museum, or at things that are beautiful or that make them think or reflect in a museum. I mean, and in the mall, things that they want. So all of a sudden you're faced with death, and I just find that very upsetting, but at the same time symbolically very appropriate.
And do you think some people go to that particular mall to, just in case they can encounter some sort of, you know, a dramatic final performance of desperation?
Maybe, I don't know. It does happen often. I mean, it happens every 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So it is something that happens often, and it's easily solved. It could be easily solved if they put some. So there are other malls in South America, in particular in Brazil, that this was happening constantly. So they put this thing in the ceiling so that people, if you jump, you don't fall, like for
some sort of netting.
Some netting, yeah. But they refuse to do it. So why don't they do it? It's also like it's. I mean, people will find another place. There's a tube. There are millions of ways you can die, but at the same time, this is easily solvable, and it's. If you wanted to avoid people jumping inside your mall, that they don't care, or it's just part of the experience. I just find it quite sinister, to be perfectly honest. I have only been to this mall once, and it is huge, and you do get lost, and you do. It's really huge, like it's gigantic, and you lose track. You get lost. You lose track of time. You lose track of space. So. What is, like, it's in a way, it is at least I got lost the only time that I went. So if you lose time of you lose track of time, and if you get spatially lost, it is kind of an experience that's also close to death. Like you are in nowhere, so you're nowhere. It's really, I don't know. I just find it very striking and upsetting and interesting too, but very sinister and very sad.
So in a way, it was taking you out of reality. But yeah, but go ahead.
I think another thing that both of them have in common is this really strange acoustic as well, because there's an echo, even though you cannot discern it because there's so many people there. It's not the same as walking past these people in the street. There's a kind of reverb, almost as if you're in some very strange dub record or something like that, So when you're, if you're feeling fragile or hungover or upset, walking through a mall can be really discombobulating, like being in a kind of aquarium. I can't really compare it to anything else. And I think the large foyers of big galleries have this effect as well, where almost like the voices of people in a swimming pool all become one kind of composite, and I find that actually not a relaxing sound.
Not at all, yeah.
And I can imagine as well if I was to witness somebody committing suicide. I mean, I saw a person fall under a tube train in London when I was living there. Somebody who'd been sitting opposite me for the last 20 minutes, and we came off at Bank Station, and he was drunk, and he fell because the platform is curved. He fell into the gap, and I saw him. I think he died. I mean, I couldn't stay, but that was one of the things that helped make up my mind about leaving London. I found that in that moment, the sound of people noticing what happened. I was the only person who witnessed it, but everyone else then saw the aftermath. As I turned away, there's something about the hysterical nature of crowds in spaces and the echoes. It just has never really left me, and I haven't been to Bank Station since either, so at least not on the platform.
Well, yeah, that's not something to be like witnessing again. But maybe the final thing that we could just talk briefly, if either of you have anything to respond, because the book was trying to think about future and in a way the imagination of future. I mean, and you've already mentioned this idea of archaeology of bizarre museums. If someone finds bits of them in I don't know 500 years, what they would find. But I don't know what before they become archaeology objects that are found somewhere in the depths of the earth. What do you think these spaces are going to be? Are we going to get more of the same, or are they going to more converge, or are we kind of, because of perhaps the pandemic, maybe a public space needs to be something else?
I think in 500 years everything will have melted, so probably there will be there's nothing, a bunch of melted steel. So not sure. But I'm not sure with them. It's a tricky question, because you think with the pandemic and the lockdowns and people being more scared of being in these spaces without air or ventilation, but people want to go there. I remember after a very long lockdown a few weeks ago, things reopened, and the lines to enter shops to buy shoes, basically shoes, were trainers, Nike and all that, were huge, and there was a lot of judgment towards the people who were lining and queuing to buy shoes. And there's there are things to discuss, and I think before judging, and because shoes in a country that was very poor for many decades, and people did not have shoes, grandparents and parents did not have shoes, so owning a good pair of shoes, it is not only something that talks about consumerism, but also about just having shoes to walk to places and to go to places. So I think even though I personally am not a fan of malls, and I'm very comfortable buying everything online that I need. I understand that these places can also be places where people do meet up, and where things happen beyond neoliberalism and its fatal and impulse, no, it's impulse towards death. So I'm not sure what will happen. I have no idea. I think these kind of huge malls will tend to disappear. But I don't know what I could be like a bit hypocritical and say, well, it might become a university, but universities are all becoming online. So what will happen with this huge building in these times? I have no idea. All I can think right now is that everything will melt because I'm just seeing the news of Canada and about museums. I do wonder too. Whether museums also need to open up in a different way, open up to society in a different way and become less of an elite space that they have become too. I think at least here in the south of the south, things are changing quite rapidly. So I'm a bit scared of being hopeful, but I'm very hopeful at the same time that things will go in a different direction here, which might mean that these buildings will also change. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's good to be hopeful, I think, even in the circumstances. And Bedwyr.
One thing I've really discovered my appreciation of the local during lockdown. I've really enjoyed spending time in my area properly and discovering paths and roads that I'd never been down before. And, as a kind of careering artist, I was always like, worried about, what could I get a show here? Could I do this? Could I do that? And it's not that I've allowed my ambition to dissolve during lockdown, but I've definitely changed the focus of it. I've realized that if I didn't have to fly again for the next 10 years, I'd be quite happy, I think. And actually flying is something that I'm finding more and more ridiculous, like when I think about people that fly halfway across the world for a short time, I think it's ridiculous. Like, I think it's hard for us to be rational about anything else while we think that that's okay, en masse. We do it en masse, and it's madness, So yeah, I've become a real, not a hippie or anything like that, but I definitely have no urge to be going to faraway places at the moment. I feel like I want to consolidate and think a bit, this is lockdown and pandemic is also coinciding, I guess, with the beginning of my midlife crisis as well. So it's a nice little bundle, But yeah, maybe something to do with modesty or something like that. I think that's something we could all learn, especially in the UK. I'm not happy with how, if we're on a raft, it feels like the country is being pushed a certain way that I really don't want to go in, Hence my interest in Welsh independence, which is what I've been obsessing about for the last 6 months.
Yeah. Definitely. We're certainly on an island right now here in the UK, an island that is a bit adrift. And yeah, thank you so much for that. But none of us really know what's the future. It's certainly both the museum and the mall are quite contested spaces where they converge or diverge from each other. We've been doing at Theatrum Mundi a study of Elephant Castle area and the shopping centre there, which it has been providing actually space for a lot of artisans, a lot of community spaces, small retail spaces, because, well, in some form or shape, we have to shop and we have to buy things. And shoes are not only a want; they are also a need, as you said, Alia. So, I mean, some of those spaces will somehow have to exist, and in what form and how public they are. That's kind of a big question. I probably, unless each of you want to add anything else, that's probably all we have time for.
Thank you. No, it was a wonderful conversation. Lovely meeting you, Bedwyr, and talking to you, and hope Wales sometime while I
nice
don't
to talk
cross
to you too,
the ocean,
Thanks
but
for the
for a
invitation.
long time. And thank you, Marta.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, both. And that was the episode 2 of the Staging Cities Concrete Netting podcast. And in the next episode, I'll be talking to artist Crystal Bennis, who is based in Edinburgh, and writer Sophie McIntosh, who is based in London. And we're going to look at very different spaces. We're going to think about sheds and ruins, the spaces left behind or the spaces improvised. And I hope you can join us for that. And in the meanwhile, you can find many other Theatrum Mundi podcasts via our website at theatrum-mundi.org or on our Anchor platform. And for now, thanks for listening and goodbye.